Hello, and yesterday thousands of people around the world submitted their NG1 or IG1 NEBOSH exam, and good luck to all of you. Many of them will now be turning their minds to the NG2 or the IG2, which is the practical assessment. Essentially it's a risk assessment and a bit of a small management report, and I'm sorry to be the bringer of bad news, but the NG2 and IG2 has a lower pass rate than the open book exam. It's harder, and it's not unusual for somewhere in the region of 30 to 40% of students to actually fail. Why is it harder? Well, it doesn't have a score. It's a simple pass or refer. You don't get a mark for this. And the issue that brings is that one critical mistake can mean that you fail the whole thing. Whereas on an exam, you make a mistake, you might lose a few points, but it's not the end of the world, you can still pass comfortably. This is so strict that I know a student who failed because they failed to put the year 2021 on their review date. They put a review date of something like the 25th of July or the 25th of October, I can't remember, but they didn't put a year. And then the examiner said in their feedback, said, well, I don't know if that's next year or in 5 years. Therefore, the review date is not clear, therefore, refer, fail. That's how strict it is. So I thought I'd give you some advice on how to pass this damn thing. First thing is read the NEBOSH guidance on this very, very carefully. It's available on the NEBOSH website. It should be available with your course provider if you have a good one. And from there, I would say use the Nebosh template. They give you a template form for this. Use the template as kind of like a checklist for what you have to do. What does that mean? On the left-hand side of the template, you'll see a column with bullet points. And that column tells you everything you need to put into the boxes. So, for example, in the introduction, it tells you things like you've got to put down the name of the company, how many people work there, you've got to put down the shift patterns, the activities, the service that it delivers. Make sure you put all of those things in there, and if anything's missing, you fail. Same again with the methodology. It tells you things like you've got to state how you identified the existing hazards, how you not the existing hazards, the existing controls, and how you identified the further controls. Now, most people, in my experience, kind of just talk about the further controls in that box, but that's not what a bullet point says. It says, how did you identify the existing controls and the further controls? Treat that like as 2 bullet points. In that same methodology box, you're going to have to talk about some guidance that you've found. It could be something like a HSG document or an ACOP, maybe several of those things. State which one you consulted and say something like, and I used this document to help me identify the further risk controls. That would be helpful. Moving on then to the risk assessment. Now, the risk assessment doesn't have any bullet points to help you. What it does have is a lot of columns, and you obviously put the information that's needed in the columns. Key mistakes to avoid though, you're going to have to put down 10 hazards at least. I wouldn't do many more than that. I wouldn't do 15 or 20, because the more hazards there are, the more likely it is you're going to cock this up. So use 10 hazards, maybe 11, but no more. Make sure you cover the 5 hazard categories, so some careful counting and checking is needed here. What's a hazard category? Well, it's things like noise, vibration, radiation, manual handling, that kind of thing. You have all of the different elements. I think it's 7 elements. Make sure 5 of those elements are covered across your hazards. Now, where it gets a bit tricky with the hazards and the risk assessment is that basically what you're trying to do here is show you can do a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. And what that means is that your control measures need to be legally compliant at the very least. So if you miss out a key control measure, which means that your organization is not legally compliant, that means you're going to fail. So for example, if you had some lifting equipment which was a hazard, the examiner is expecting you to put down something like a thorough examination. They expect to see somewhere in the controls, either on the existing controls or on the further risk controls, they expect to see 6 or 12 monthly thorough examinations of the equipment. They're also going to expect things like training, because training is legally required, isn't it? And maintenance. and inspection and supervision and all of those things. So I would very carefully look at what the law requires on that hazard. So you might have to, download LOLA and PURE and the manual handling regs and so on. Even better, start to look at your course materials, start to look at the ACOPs and the guidance documents on these to check if there are any controls which are recommended as standard within the industry. And if you're not currently doing it, put it in the further risk controls. If you are currently doing it, put it in the existing risk controls. Okay, so that's your risk assessment. Moving on to your report. We're already at nearly a 6-minute video here. We can go on for an hour talking about this, but make sure you talk about both the civil and criminal consequences when discussing the general arguments for health and safety. When talking about the specific legal arguments, what that means is quote some legislation which is currently maybe being broken and explain why that legislation is being broken in your opinion. So you could argue, for example, that the LOLA regulations require that thorough examinations are carried out on equipment, and that at the moment they're not currently being done, and therefore you are currently in breach of that legislation. That's the kind of argument you want to say. What does the law require? What are we doing? Why is it being broken? The likelihood and severity, big mistake people make there is they talk about scores and numbers. We're not interested in scores and numbers. That's a little bit old-fashioned, risk matrices and all that. Sorry if I'm being controversial there. But there are no scores on the NEBOSH or HSE 5 steps to risk assessment, so we're going to stay away from scores. What they do want, though, is for you to explain why you think an incident is likely or not. So they're expecting you to talk about how many people are involved, how often do they do the task, how long are they exposed to the hazard for, how many accidents have happened in the past, which gives you an idea of the likelihood, that kind of thing. So talk about the likelihood in that sense. Severity, not looking for scores, but they are looking to see how bad a potential accident could be. So there we are. I'm going to stop there because we're over 7 minutes now, but just use that template as a checklist and go for it with a fine tooth comb, and don't worry about word count. There is no word count on the NG2. One final word is, please do not message me asking me to check it, because the answer will be no. It's your work, not mine.